teachers, so there'll be a test after this, so pay attention. So, all right, so go ahead. The American Expeditionary Force really started long before World War I. It started in Mexico. Okay, so hit the slide for me. Slide, please. What happened here? Okay, well, here's a map of Mexico in the United States.
There it comes. It's loading.
Loading? We didn't have these technical problems in World War I, so. There we go, all right. In 1911, the first Mexican Revolution started, and President Taft was concerned about it, falling over into the United States. So he created what's called the Maneuver Division. About 10,000 troops were sent on the border. They sat there. By the time they got there, the Mexican Revolution was over. So they disbanded. But a lot of the people that came out of the Maneuver Division were still in the Army in 1917 when the AEF started. So I'm going to talk about the Mexican Revolution and the punitive expedition. So hit next slide. There we go. Carranza was the president of Mexico. Pancho Villa wanted to be the president of Mexico, and President Wilson, of course, backed Carranza and didn't like Villa. The Mexican border was slightly policed, okay? Those days it was a little sign, and it was one Mexican on one side and an American on the other, and they just shook hands and smoked and drank and partied together. And that was the security that we had, right? Not much different from today. Oh, back up. Here we go. Hold on a second here. This thing is really out of whack, but all right. So Pancho Villa wanted to be president of Mexico, so the only way he wanted to get the presidency was to involve Mexico in a war, because he thought since he was a great general, he could probably defeat the United States. So he actually attacked the United States. He crossed the border, Columbus, New Mexico, 9 March 1916. Okay, so he didn't represent Mexico. He was a Mexican warlord, bandito, whatever you want to call him. But he killed 14 U.S. soldiers and 10 civilians. Now, on the way out of the United States, we took out 73 of his people. So it was really not a smart move on his part. Okay, next slide. And this, they burned a couple stores in Columbus, New Mexico. And Americans, remember, the only thing we had communication-wise was newspapers. So by the time the newspapers reporters wrote it up and said, hey, we've been attacked by the Mexicans, people in the United States are going, who? What? Where's Columbus, New Mexico? So technically we were invaded, if you want to look at it that way. Next slide. All right. So Wilson says, okay, we're not going to put up with that. We're going to send 10,000 U.S. Army troops down to hunt Pancho Villa, and we're going to, snatch him up and arrest him or whatever. And we told the Mexicans the sovereignty of Mexico is primary once we cross your border. They didn't think that was cool. Blackjack Pershing was selected as a commander. It was all regular Army units that went into Mexico. Okay, next slide. Here's Pershing on the left of there wearing the Montana peak hat, which I have one. And here's his staff car, which looks kind of like a Ford, because all cars basically were Fords in it. All right, next slide. So Pershing entered Mexico, and the Mexican people were not happy to see American troops, obviously. And he had some serious problems because not only the banditos were fighting us, the local people would take shots at us, so we weren't really well liked in Mexico at that point. So they're trying to negotiate with the president. The president's like, I really can't do much because the Mexican people don't want you here, and Pancho Villa is just a thug, and so things were not looking good. Villa raided the United States again in Texas on the 6th of May, so twice he's attacked us, okay? Now this did not make the Wilson administration look like they knew what they were doing, okay? That did not go over too well with the American public. So in 1916, they had the National Defense Act, and they created the National Guard. So all the state militias, which this is the 29th from Virginia, and that's the 26th from New England. So all the state militias were created as National Guard units. Next slide. And then he put 100,000 guardsmen on the border, just in case Villa came back again. So now you've got the active army in Mexico. You got the National Guard protecting the border. Think about that one, all In the meantime, U.S. population said, "Hey, let's declare war on these people. We're tired of fooling with these Mexicans. Well, Wilson didn't really want to do that. That's just not his plan. But if you look at it, almost the entire active army was in Mexico, and the entire National Guard of the country was on the border. So if we'd been attacked on both coasts, we would have been kind of SOL at that point. All right, next slide. So eventually the Mexicans started forcing their president, saying, get these Americans out of here, forget Villa, just get them out of here. So we negotiated, and we finally, in 1917, the forces came back into Texas. Okay, so the active army is back on our property. They didn't capture Pancho Villa, not a big deal. If you think of it in the big strategic picture, he really wasn't the reason. The reason was to train the army. That's what I think. But you really can't find that anywhere. Nobody ever wrote that down. But first time we had the regular guard, or regular forces and guard forces together, we used trucks, aircraft, and the Army staff officers actually could, maneuver and plan and do all the things they were supposed to. Next slide. Here's a modern truck and a modern airplane, the Jenny. Okay, next slide. Now, what I represent is the 116th Infantry 29th Division. These are basic citizen soldiers. Now think about this. They're called into federal service in 1916. They're mustered out in February of 17. And not even a month later, they're called back to federal service. Okay? Now a weekend warrior is going to go, what? Daddy, where are you going? Now, the thing that people don't understand, if the Guard was called back in March of 1917, and Wilson didn't declare war until April of 17, it was already in the works. We were going to go to war regardless, okay? And the telegram that Don's going to mention from the Germans to Mexico kind of was the kindle, but that didn't really mean a whole lot if the Guard got called out to federal service in March. So the plans were already in the making. So many of these guys come back, they're mustered into federal service in August. 2 years later, they're decommissioned, and then they're sent home. So they've been on active duty less 1 month for 3 years. So the medals I have are Mexican Border, World War I Victory Medal, the Occupation Medal, because they stayed in France and occupied Germany, and the Croix de Guerre, which is a French award. So anyway, this is the beginning of the American Expeditionary Force, the Mexican punitive expedition. Now, Mexico hasn't attacked us lately, but anyway, we still have a border situation. So, all right. So we're going to get into the AEF. I'm going to let the captain talk because he's all excited. He's all excited about this.
So if you can switch over there to our World War I presentation. So some of you may know that just a couple of days ago was the anniversary, 99th anniversary of Wilson's declaration of war against Germany in 1917.
Oh, wait a minute.
So next year will be centennial. It'll be the 100th. And that's one of the reasons why, thank you, Corporal. That's one of the reasons why we thought that, Stuart and I thought that this would be a great program to start educating people about World War I. As we know, there are no surviving World War I veterans anymore. And so a lot of that legacy is lost. A lot of that legacy is gone. So one of the things we wanted to talk about, not only the background of how the AEF got started, but also why did America get involved in this war? Because that's probably a question a lot of people have today. Most people are familiar with the reasons for World War II. We've got Pearl Harbor. People know about the reasons for why we were involved in Vietnam or why we got involved in Iraq or things like this. But part of that understanding of how the United States got involved in its first modern war in 1917 has been lost. And so we wanted to kind of convey a little bit of that. Go ahead. So you'll have to push the little volume there, and we'll listen to a speech by General John J. Blackjack Pershing, famous speech that he said.
Well,
Yeah, you might have to turn that up a little bit.
yeah.
Hit escape and then go to the sound.
We can, hold up a second.
Okay.
We can play that through.
So we didn't have that problem in Europe or in the trenches or anything.
We had the Victrola. All you had to do was wind
We
it.
yelled at each other, so there wasn't a problem.
How does he get the name Blackjack?
Yeah, the way he got the name Blackjack is during his time in the Apache Wars and also during his time in the Spanish-American War, if I recall. He was in charge of a unit of African-American soldiers, the 10th Cavalry. Of course, his nickname that he got was rather crude and was something that we couldn't use in present company, but his original name was that. And, of course, they kind of, euphemized it down to Blackjack. So, but that was his nickname. Yeah.
This fellow West Pointers didn't think that was a real good command to have. All
Yeah.
cavalry units, so they let him know about it.
Yeah, he caught some flack.
He comes back later and makes them all look bad.
Yep.
You get it higher? I mean, if not, that's okay.
That's fine. We'll play what we got.
I can get another speaker.
Basically, what he's saying is he's telling the American public why the soldiers are going to fight in France. That's
Yeah.
really all it is. But it's
Yeah.
his actual voice of reporting. So.
Yeah. Now, General Pershing, selected ahead of other contemporary general officers, was a controversial leader. And it was actually Frederick Funston, right? He was the one who died. He was originally selected by Wilson, or he was in the slot to be selected as the commander of the AEF when we got involved in World War I. And he unfortunately died from a stroke or a heart attack, if I recall.
Can you imagine that, getting ready to be appointed as commander of an army to go to Europe and you die? I mean, what's a bad decision?
Yeah. But Wilson, it was fortunate in some ways for the United States because Wilson then, of course, selected Pershing. And Pershing, as we know, worked out very well. Gentlemen, I wouldn't worry about it at this point. We're good. Yeah. We'll go to the next slide.
Play it later.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so just a little background on who I am portraying today. And this was Captain Alfred H. Grizzled of C Company 102nd Infantry Division, 102nd Infantry Regiment, 26th Yankee Division. They were called the Yankee Division because they were all out of New England. So these are all gentlemen from Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, places like that. And Grizzled, he's kind of an example of your average American soldier and why their participation in World War I was so important. So I'm going to read you a little statement from him. Okay, my name is Captain Alfred Herbert Grizzled. I hail from New Britain, Connecticut. Now, I was one of the first American soldiers to see combat in World War I. I was the 45-year-old commander of C Company, 102nd Infantry Regiment, 26th Division. Our division was a National Guard division, nicknamed the Yankee Division, or the YD, since we were made up of men from New England. I had served previously as a young sergeant in the same unit during the Spanish-American conflict. On April 20th, 1918, my company was involved in the Battle of Seicheprey, France, the first major engagement between American forces and the Imperial German Army. We were surprise attacked on a rainy night while conducting a relief of companies L and M in the frontline trenches in the Ramirez Woods near the town of Seicheprey. Over 1,500 veteran German soldiers and 500 elite Stoßtruppen, stormtroops, attacked our 250 men or so, holding the lines that night. After an intense barrage and a gas attack, the stormtroops attacked our dugouts with flamethrowers, grenades, and satchel charges. Many of my men were quickly overwhelmed, killed, wounded, captured, or buried in their dugouts within the first 15 minutes of the attack. The rest fought to the death. I fought with my pistol until I ran out of ammunition. When I had no other choice, in tears, I surrendered. The Germans were walking me towards their lines when several artillery rounds landed nearby. I used this opportunity to make a break for it. And I made it back to my own lines, shell-shocked, but able to report to the divisional commander. I was recommended for the DSC, and I received the Croix de Guerre from the French government. I represent the face of the American soldier in World War I. The Germans said later they were surprised at the resistance the American soldiers put up. The Germans stated in their reports that French or British soldiers would have most likely given up ground rather than fight to the death like many of the doughboys did. Although the Germans won this first round, we knew that as more and more of us arrived, that would change. We Americans were the new blood, infused into this war at just the right time and in the right numbers to finally end this Holocaust and make the world safe for democracy. And that really was the turning point in the war. There's a lot of argument, there is a lot of controversy about what role the AEF, the American Expeditionary Forces, played in World War I, but it was instrumental. It was a factor that led to the defeat of Germany. By 1918, the French and the British were pretty much burned out, and there wasn't much in the way of offensive operations that they could offer. Germany was still very strong. They had signed a peace treaty with the Russians, and they had moved most of their divisions from Russia, the eastern side, over to the western front. So it was a very strong Hindenburg line there that was all along Germany, and there was no way the British and French could have done this on their own. So to have the Americans coming in 1918 was very fortunate, and that's what sealed the deal and ended the war. Go ahead. Yeah. General facts about the AEF, and then I'll turn the next slide over to Corporal Lawrence here. In April of 1917, after Germany's continuation of unrestricted U-boat warfare and the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, and this is what Stuart was talking about earlier, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Imperial Germany and the Central Powers. So the Germans had stupidly sent a telegram to Mexico, and the offer that they had made to Mexico was that they would return some of the territory in the United States that had been lost in the Mexican-American War, places like New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California, if Mexico would ally with Germany and attack the United States. This was intercepted by the British. It was turned over to Wilson and the American government. And as you can imagine at that point, Wilson, who had tried to keep the United States out of war for such a long time, said, really, this is going to make us look like fools if we do not declare war. And of course, he asked Congress to declare war on April 6th. The draft. The draft was very controversial, something that had not been done since the Civil War. Because this was a huge modern conflict, an industrial war, the United States realized they were going to need a lot of men to fight this war. And even though they had had some good experience as far as, like Stuart was talking about, along the Mexican border, they were going to need to draft and conscript. 70% were inducted under the Selective Service Act of 18 May 1917. By the end of the war, over 4 million soldiers were mobilized. Almost 2 million were serving in Europe. For comparison, the German army in 1918 had 5.5 million. So you can see why we needed so many men to fight the German army. The American Expeditionary Forces were latecomers. However, during the last few months of the war, it was incredibly costly for the United States. So sometimes people say, well, the Americans did not contribute that much to World War I. They were only really fighting in the last few months of the war. But take a look at the combat that was going on. It was some of the most intense combat that the United States Army has probably seen. Killed in action, over 36,000, died of wounds, died of disease. There was, of course, the infamous flu epidemic, the Spanish flu in 1918, which didn't help things. And then you can see some of the other numbers there too. Total wounded, total casualties, prisoners of war, and missing. This was, the last few months, was some of the most intense combat that has been seen by the U.S. Army. Next slide.
One of the interesting things is that Al Capone's brother was drafted. So the draft was for everybody. Okay. The divisions, I've got them up here. The one I want to bring out is the 2nd Division, which was Army and Marines. Okay, normally the Marines don't work with the Army, but the Marines didn't want to get left out of the war. So they showed up with this uniform, and they were originally given Army uniforms, which with Marine buttons, which they didn't particularly like. Eventually it went to a forest green uniform with Marine buttons, but everything else was Army. So the other one is the 26th to the 42nd. They were all National Guard units. The last one down here, the 93rd, was the Negro Infantry Division. Now, when Pershing got to Europe, the Army staff didn't want any black units, combat units. They could offload ships, they could drive trucks, whatever, but they didn't want them in combat. So he offered the British the 92nd, or the 93rd, because the British wanted American troops. So the Persian said, I have a black division, I'll loan you. And they said, thank you, but no thank you. The French said, we'll take them. So they fought with the French in French helmets, and the 93rd patch is a French helmet, which is back in that case. So that's the discrimination in World War I was pretty rampant. Next slide. Oh, spyware, that's nice. Okay, the major battles, Cheshire, Cantigny, Bella Wood, and the Saint Mihiel, and of course the Meuse Argonne, which is the last one. And I'm not going to get into every single battle, but the Meuse Argonne was the one that our friend Sergeant York from Tennessee, that's when he fought in. Next slide.
And there's a map up here we have for you later if you want to see some of the...
Yeah. Basically, Meuse Argonne is right here. This is the combat strength that Don talked about. We started out very slowly, and we ended up with almost 2 million troops in France. Once the war ended, the problem that the 29th Division had, that I'm representing, there wasn't any transportation back home. Nobody thought about that. Everybody thought about sending the troops over, but once the war ended, oh, now we got to get them back. So we had to rent British freighters and passenger liners to get our troops back. So you can see where that went over well. The soldier right here, mainly it was an immigrant army, okay, because a lot of immigrants were over here in the United States, and they were first and second generation, so they were drafted first. What Don didn't tell you about the draft was that the AFL, American Federation of Labor, made a deal with the Army that don't draft our union people because we need them to make uniforms, helmets, weapons. Leave them in the factories and then just draft everybody who's non-union. And that's exactly what happened. So you can see where that was going to be a little problem after the war. A lot of them couldn't read English at all. They could speak a great foreign language, but they couldn't read any English. So those troops that had very poor English skills were kept back for 30 extra days of training before they were sent to France. And they used comic books to teach them English, which is about, what you would think in 1917, 1918. Anybody have a German last name or Austrian last name? Okay.
My grandparents was Liebener when in Germany was Liebener. That's their last name. I'm German descent.
Okay, so the intelligence people in the Army would ask you a question. Could you kill your first cousin?
No.
Then you would be declared a undesirable alien and released from active duty. That's exactly how they train. If you said, no, I have no problem shooting my cousin, then you're in. So that's how the Army intelligence took care of the security clearances. Next slide. Some of the Medal of Honor people, Alvin York, Colonel Donovan, who would go on to lead the Office of Special Strategic Services, which is the OSS, which became the CIA. Whittlesey, who was the Lost Battalion commander. And I got Freddie Stowers up here. He was just a corporal, but he was a black corporal who didn't get his Medal of Honor until 1991. And MacArthur's got silver stars, 7. He still holds the record. Nobody else has ever gotten 7 silver stars, so that's why he's up there. And of course, George Patton, another one. Go ahead. Women contributions. You want to take care of this, or you want me to?
Go for it.
All right. You notice that every nurse up there is either Army or Navy, and the only one that's not is an American Red Cross nurse. She was a British citizen, left Britain, came to the United States, and then went back over as a nurse, and she got a Distinguished Service Cross. She's the only civilian of the war. And of course, women were used for ambulance drivers, telephone operators, and clerks. And that's basically women did contribute to the war. Go ahead. All right. Now, Don's a big animal lover, so here we go.
You betcha. One other thing, just to kind of pair it along with what Stuart was talking about earlier about the immigrant mix, and there's that famous quote. There was a lieutenant who had been captured during the Battle of the Meuse Argonne, and he was with the 77th, if I remember the Lost Battalion. And they sat him down, and pardon my politically incorrect speech, but the Germans were saying, how come you Americans are fighting so hard? And he said, well, he says, you don't realize what you're up against. He says, you're up against the worst collection of New York City Jew boy, Dago, Polak gangsters that you could imagine. Okay? Anyway. Cher Ami, very famous. This was a carrier pigeon. Of course, they used carrier pigeons as backups because, as you can imagine, the technology of communication in those days was problematic. Okay? So they did use carrier pigeons at times, and during the very famous Lost Battalion, they were being hammered by their own artillery in an accidental friendly fire situation. And while they were in the forest, they had to release this, I think it was the last carrier pigeon they had left, Cher Ami. And on there was, of course, strapped onto her ankle, the tiny little capsule was the note that said, we are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. So when they released this pigeon, the Germans took a couple of shots at her. Evidently, she was wounded, I think, through the breastbone and through the right leg, but she managed to make it. She made it all the way back to the headquarters and delivered the message, and they were able to call off the artillery attack. She did receive the Croix de Guerre, and upon death is preserved with taxidermy and displayed in the Smithsonian Institute. You can see her there. Okay, another famous animal, and those of you I think that had seen my presentation I did on the Battle of Seicheprey might remember this one, and his name was Stubby. He was kind of like a pit bull mix, and he came from New England with the 26th Division. And he was a little dog that became their mascot. He had been wounded in the leg at Seicheprey and reportedly would bark to warn of gas attacks. I don't know if that's just kind of, apocryphal or if it really was true, but that's reportedly.
That's a gas attack.
And that would work just as good as a dog bark, as you can imagine. So, yeah. He was awarded 2 wound stripes and he was promoted to sergeant. He was given a medal from the Humane Society by Pershing. Pershing personally awarded him a medal. And he also is displayed at the Smithsonian. I think the Smithsonian likes to collect all these stuffed animals from wars. So, next slide. And there's a picture of Cher Ami up there in the upper left-hand corner. And there's a picture of Stubby. As you can see, he wore a full uniform that a couple of, I think it was YMCA ladies had sewn together with all of his medals on it and patches and everything. Next slide. The Army Air Service, the start of U.S. military aviation took place during this war. Now, as Stuart had mentioned, they also used aircraft during the punitive expedition. But the United States really started to form their own aviation and their own, military aviation unit during World War I. American volunteers flew for France in the Lafayette Escadrille as early as 1960, before the Americans were even involved officially in the war. We had volunteers flying over there for the French. You can see the number of officers and enlisted. And the aircraft, of course, like as you'll see here soon, most of the weaponry, the United States was unprepared for supplying their military with the weaponry because the military required was so huge during World War I. So we had to borrow a lot of our weaponry from the French and the British, and a lot of our equipment too. So every aircraft that the United States used in combat in World War I was of French design. The Newport 17, the Newport 28, and then the Spad. So, next slide. American heroes of the Army Air Service. Brigadier Billy Mitchell, of course, who became even more famous after the war for some of his controversial ideas about military aviation and its role. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, I'm sure you have heard of. 26 aerial victories, the highest scoring American ace. And First Lieutenant Frank Luke, who was also a ace and was noted as being a balloon buster and unfortunately was killed. Luke Air Force Base in Arizona was named after him posthumously. Next slide. And there's some pictures of these gentlemen, Mitchell, Rickenbacker, and Luke. Next slide. Do you want to talk about the weapons? Okay, all right. Sure. In 1917, as I mentioned, America was unprepared to supply an army of over 2 million men. So the vast majority of equipment and weaponry had to be borrowed from our allies and was either of French or British in manufacture. The artillery that we use, the French 77 millimeter cannon and the 105 millimeters Schneider artillery pieces are what equipped our artillery units. You'll even see pictures, especially some of the National Guard units like the 26. Their artillery units came over without any artillery whatsoever to France. The French supplied them with these guns that are absolutely a joke. Originally, some of the batteries had these guns that look like these old-fashioned black powder cannons. But they very quickly were able to get the 77 millimeters and the 105 millimeters. I think that was Pershing's work. He demanded they get modern weaponry. The French shot, which was an 8 millimeter light machine gun, which was an absolute mechanical nightmare. It's this thing you see over here on the left. The Americans were developing a much better one, which we'll show you in just a few minutes, as far as an actual, I guess you would call it like a light machine gun or an assault, what we would call today in the military, some of you are familiar with this, a squad automatic weapon. So this is what they used, right, a saw. But it was absolutely horrible. It jammed all the time. It had this kind of half-moon shaped magazine, and dirt and dust and mud got in there. Can you imagine using that in a trench? So the French Hotchkiss, which was a heavy machine gun, which was strip-fed, and that was problematic too because you had this strip of bullets that would go in. Okay, and then we had the French and British hand grenades. The Americans really didn't develop their own hand grenade, and the one they developed turned out to be a failure. And then the British small box respirator gas mask, which Stuart has a copy of here to show you. And that's what that looked like.
You've got two little points in it that pinch your nose off. You have to grab the mouthpiece, and you can't even talk. So, I don't want to make us look bad here at the museum, but our curator actually had an original, and she opened it up and she left it out, and she and a couple of people working back there kind of got sick because there was still gas in the original. If you ever get an original one, make sure you clean the canister out. Go ahead.
Then, of course, there was the Brodie helmet, which was British design. Americans were working on a prototype of a helmet. Problem is, it looked way too much like the German helmet. So that would have caused some problems had they used it. So they just adopted the British Brodie. Gas, as long as we're on the subject here. And I'm going to have Stuart go ahead and show you the German gas mask too, which you can see looks like a much better design, and for all intents and purposes probably was.
So basically you can actually talk with this on.
Yeah.
And these are easy to get rid of.
Yeah. And part of the thing was Germany was way ahead of the Allies with her technology as far as gas warfare. They were the ones who started gas warfare, although the Allies, of course, countered. Now, gas. The interesting thing about it is when you see these movies and everything from World War I, you always think this was such a horrible warfare, such a horrible weapon that was used and everything. And certainly, if you were on the receiving end of it, it was. But a very small percentage of deaths were actually attributed to gas. Only 4% of the men who died during the war, it was due to gas, poisonous gases. The basic categories, there was irritant, which was what we would call today tear gas. And actually that was used quite a lot. You want to clear out a bunker or a trench, you're going to hit it with tear gas. And that's going to cause those soldiers in there to move out real quick. There was pulmonary respiratory agents such as phosgene and chlorine, and those were pretty bad. If you got those of course would damage your lungs. It would make it so it would be impossible to breathe. Many of the soldiers, once their lungs filled with fluid or mucus, they would basically drown in their own mucus. And then the blister agents, which were pretty bad too. Mustard gas, landing on any exposed or bare skin, that would burn the skin, blister it pretty horribly. Probably the worst legacy of gas warfare is what carried over after the war. Because many soldiers were not killed outright by these gases, but they suffered such horrible, debilitating wounds, like their lungs or the blister agents, that this kind of stuff carried over into lots of health problems for decades after the war. My father remembers growing up in Chicago, one of his neighbors was a World War I vet who had been exposed to chlorine gas. And this poor gentleman had horrible respiratory problems, and it wound up finishing him off early in his life around the age of 60 or so. he died from a lot of those effects of that poison gas buildup.
Back up a second. Okay. The second picture up there with the gas, it's great. It's great when the wind is going your way, but if the wind changed, guess who got gassed? Next slide. Go ahead. All right, 45 caliber pistol, 1911 version, which was basically issued to officers, NCOs, machine gunners, and couriers. The 45 continued to be used in the Army until 1985. I switched hats because when I got to France, I had no place to put my Montana peak hat. You couldn't put it in a duffel bag. So you had to wear the French hat, which most Americans liked. Go ahead, next one. All right, 1903 Springfield, which the captain will hopefully not shoot himself, but never mind. This was the original weapon that went over with the first American troops, 1917 June to about late 1917. Always the argument is Sergeant York did not carry this. He carried what you're going to see in a minute. This was an early version. In World War II, they would change the barrel out and give it to the Marines. This is what the Marines carried in Guadalcanal. So it's basically the same weapon, 30-06, 5 round. Next slide. This, of course, is the Springfield, which did go over middle of 1917. It's got the long bayonet on it, so this is a very intimidating weapon, at least just about the size of it. Even a small soldier could really do a good job on that. We had the longest bayonet on the battlefield.
Both weapons 30-06 in caliber. Just still the American caliber, if you ask me. Just personal preference.
Well, I guess you could say we had the biggest bullet on the battlefield. If it makes any sense. All right, go ahead. Next one, the Browning automatic rifle. We cannot get one of these. These are very illegal, but you can get your plastic model. But it was a very effective weapon. It had 20 rounds detachable magazine. Unfortunately, for us, it came out very late in the war, so very few of these were actually used in combat. They got to Europe, they just weren't used because the war ended.
These were the ones that were replacing that French shot that we showed you. It would have been much more effective, would have been a much better weapon for the Americans, but unfortunately, it did come out too late.
This also, back up. This also became popular with gangsters.
But it is not a regular 30-06 round.
Yes.
It is 30-06.
It's 20.
Interchangeable with that.
Yep.
Right, 20 30-06 rounds in a clip could open up a bank very easily. So a lot of the gangsters that had experience in this weapon turned to crime. So okay, go ahead. Browning machine gun. This is the Hotchkiss. This is our machine gun. This is an American made. It's water cooled, which of course, if you don't have any water, you can use body fluids and anything else to cool it down. But it was also 30-06. So we have one round that went to all weapons except for the 45. So that was easy for supply reasons. Obviously, you didn't want to switch the 8mm French and the 6.5. I mean, it just got ridiculous. So next slide. All right. You want to talk about Patton? Patton loves this tank.
Sure. So, just like we discussed the birth of the military aviation during World War I, World War I was special because, of course, it was the birth of armored warfare. And the American Tank Corps used primarily this French tank you see here, this little light French tank called the Renault. Now, the Renault was the tank that Patton's units used during the Meuse-Argonne and several other battles to support the American infantry. They still had not quite figured out armored tactics at this time. Patton was one of the front runners on that. He was one of the people who was experimenting around with how armor could make a difference on the battlefield. But at this time, they were still following the other Allies' doctrine, the French and the British, which was the armor is just there basically to support the infantry. And yeah, it was a very small tank, two-man tank. And I had the privilege of actually being able to get inside one of these and check it out at a museum out in California. There's a guy who has a private collection, and they're very, very small. I mean, it is like sitting in a tiny little bathtub. That's about the size of it. Well, Stuart and I, of course, are here to answer any questions you may have about the American Expeditionary Forces. So if there is anything you want to know about what you just learned about, or if there's anything you want to know about the stuff that we brought today, or uniforms, or the units or divisions, or any of that, fire away. Yes, sir?
Term doughboy, where did it come from?
Aha! And there are some very interesting theories about that, because nobody is exactly sure.
Had nothing to do with military.
No. At the very beginning, our allies called the American soldiers Sammies for Uncle Sam. That didn't sit real well with the Americans. They didn't like that term. So doughboy, they think, may have come out of the punitive expedition, and that a lot of the soldiers were working around, of course, adobe clay down there in places like New Mexico and the Mexican border in Arizona. And so getting a lot of this material on them, maybe this light dust or this desert sand, as they're marching along, maybe somebody made the comment of, hey, you look like you're covered in dough, you know, doughboy. There's also the theory that it came from the amount of money that American soldiers brought to France with them, since they were some of the best paid out of any of the soldiers of the Allied armies. And there's also a theory about the buttons, which I've always thought is very strange, and I'm not really 100% sure on what the connection is there, but something about there was some sort of biscuit called a doughboy, and it looked very much like the shape of the button. So none of them are conclusive, but somehow it stuck. Yeah. Any others?
Can I ask one question? The AEF, that umbrella that covers the AEF, does that include forces like, of course, in my case, Navy, which had little involvement, I'm sure, but...
Yeah, the Navy was not within the American Expeditionary Forces, but the Navy did fulfill a very important role during World War I. And I was talking to Rich about this earlier. There's a great book, if you get a chance to read it. Richard Rubin wrote a book called Last of the Doughboys, which if you want to read any one book about World War I and the American involvement, I would highly recommend. And in there he devotes a chapter or two to the participation of the Navy. And the Navy was very instrumental. If we did not have the naval forces, the destroyers and escorts and corvettes and frigates that were helping escorting the soldiers over to France, it would have been a problem, because remember, there was still a big problem with the German U-boat threat. And the Navy really is what protected most of our forces that were going over there. And so the Navy did serve a huge role, and a lot of that experience, especially the anti-U-boat type of work, the anti-submarine warfare, would come in handy, of course, in World War II, what they had learned from World War I. So, is there anything you wanted to add to
The
that?
U.S. Navy actually taught the British what the convoy system was.
Yeah.
Before that, the British would send one ship over, and if it got sunk, well, they'd send another one. If I got sunk, eventually the Navy said, let's get together here. So they actually taught the British the convoy system against the U-boats. They also ran the ports, and pretty much controlled all the French ports, all the French in particular like that.
Just to add, though, Jerome Michelet, Jerome's a French naval officer, and I think you mentioned Brest was a major port for us.
Yes.
Yeah, if you don't
And St.
mind,
Nazaire.
I could take the floor for 5 minutes and bring in the French perspective to what you just said.
Sure.
So, it's impromptu. So
No, go ahead.
Much.
This won't be testable.
I'm French, coming from Brest, which has been a city very much involved in the transportation of American troops back and forth, actually. First, before that, the French consideration for the American troops coming, it was really huge. And after 4 years of devastating war, everybody was completely exhausted. If you ever visit France, you'll see in every single village there is a monument to the dead people coming from that village. And in every single small village, you see dozens of young people who died during World War I. So everybody was exhausted, and when the German got their reinforcement from the east front, which were no longer busy with the Soviet Union, with Russia, who just had become Soviet Union, then it was really a great relief to see more fresh troops coming, and as was said, pushed the balance on the appropriate side. So thanks again for that, on behalf of the French nation, of course.
If you don't mind me interrupting, Pershing, of course, showed up, and the first thing he did is he visited Lafayette's tomb. And he said the famous words, Lafayette, nous voilà, right? Which means we are here.
Yeah, this is known in French history book, Lafayette, nous voilà. I learned that in elementary school as the American said, we are paying back your help during the revolution. It is known in French history books. So thanks for that. My grandfather participated in World War I and was gassed, and I came to know him with his crippled lungs. And what I remember from him was his coughing, that because he had something like 80% of his lungs were destroyed, and he lived his whole life until I came to know him in that state. So that was that bad. Fortunately, all those weapons were banned after World War I because it was considered really too horrible even for war. So thanks for all these efforts for that. The Croix de Guerre is a real war medal. It's not a commemoration war. So it's attributed to units who actually made war. I mean, myself, after 27 years of military service, I don't have it. I made many operations, but not war enough to wear that. So it's a medal you can be proud of. That. Now, back to my topic. Brest was one of the 4 harbors mentioned to have received the American troops. When the American troops arrived there, they were not dispatched immediately to war. They stayed there to get some acclimatization to whatever, some training, accommodation to food also. It was somehow different from the food you were used to, some instruction about how to behave, everything. So there were some camps in the vicinity of the city where I come from, in Brest, and people remember that. And the same camps were used again on the way back, because suddenly the war was over, and you had how many?
Several million, yeah, 2 million. Yeah.
2 million troops
Yeah.
to bring back. At that time, you did not have those airlines carrying people. Didn't exist. So everybody had to be brought back home by boat. And there were just not that many boats. So soldiers remained there for months in Brest, in the very same camp that hosted them in the way in. Those were used in the way out again. For some of them, it probably took nearly a year for the latest of them.
Some were on occupation duty in Germany, parts of Germany too, yeah.
That we remember in Brest to have received President Wilson and his wife coming to Brest, and they were very much welcomed by the city as a thank to the American contribution to the war. So the people in Brest remember that still now. After World War II, actually, when Brest was had become a base for the American submarines, and as such has been pretty much completely destroyed. I mean, in the city center of Brest, 3 houses remained. That is the state of Brest after World War II. So then, the American president asked what could be done for that, and his wife at the time was a good friend of the mayor of Denver City, and the wife told the Denver mayor, "Hey, this city of Brest, who had welcomed us so warmly after World War I and is now destroyed, can you do something to help them?" And this is when Denver, in the middle of America, and Brest, a sea city, became sister cities. And that was the second sister city program in the whole United States done at that time. So now you know, Denver and Brest are sister cities, and it's still the case. My wife has been actively participating to that program before we moved here 8 months ago. So it is still valid, and this is because of World War I and because of all the American troops staying in Brest for months, way in, way out, and this is still remembered in Brest. So that was my contribution to your excellent briefing.
Thank you.
One of the items that he mentioned was that the Americans were told to basically behave themselves. On the back there in the case, there's a YMCA French-English dictionary. So you would think, well, that would be important if you were in France. But the YMCA, being the Young Man's Christian Association, had blacked out all the words that were, you didn't want to use in France. So, you had to learn that once you got there.
Mademoiselle,
That's right, yeah. So any other questions? Yes, sir.
My grandfather was a sergeant, and he fought hand-to-hand combat in the Verdun and used Argonne. But he said that it's either kill or be killed, just hand-to-hand. He said on Armistice Day, a colonel drove up in a Jeep and said the war's over, but it says here it went to December 18th on the Verdun. What's that about on the map?
Yeah.
Oh, right here? Yeah. That's a good question. I'll have to look that one up. Because the armistice line was November 11th here.
Maybe it was on
So,
I don't know. Must be 17.
It could have been.
yeah, it might be a typo. Because, I don't know. I'll have to look at that one. This is the hand weapon. It's got brass knuckles. Of course, it came out of New York or the East Coast. It's got a point on the back, and it's got a very sharp knife. This is illegal in most states. But your point was that there was no rules in trench warfare, so you kill or be killed. The other comment that you made on November 11th, the last American was killed at 10:59 a.m. that morning. And Pershing caught a lot of flack in 1921 when they investigated the war, because so many parents of soldiers that died that day said everybody knew the war was over. Even the Germans were telling the Americans to go back. And of course, Pershing, being the chief of staff of the army and all that, nothing became of it. But there was a lot of questions as why the Americans attacked just before the war ended. So you had that last soldier killed syndrome that nobody, that really bled into Korea, Vietnam, even today for that matter. So, good point. Any other questions? Somebody? Yes, sir.
I had one. How significant is communications? I'm a pilot guy in the military now. What was King's communication? Was still using flags, or were they using
Telephone. Yeah. Telephone was problematic, as you can imagine, as it always has been in warfare, because you have to lay down lines. And so with your lines, of course, those are going to get cut. Either they're going to get cut by German sappers, or they're going to get cut by artillery, which happened quite frequently, of course. And then you have to send out more guys to go lay lines, and those were the ones that the Germans would target. Their snipers would say, hey, that guy with the big wheel of wire on his back, bang, because we can cut off their communications. And yeah, so communications was extremely problematic. Radio was still kind of in its infancy. Touch and go.
Was there actually a job radio operator, or was it just somebody?
Yeah, there sure was, and I imagine it probably would have extended from the same, like if you would have called it in those days MOS, as somebody who was also the telephone operator, just a basic communications guys. And then, as we mentioned, visual communications were important. Flag, semaphore was being used, and then of course pigeons, was the fallback. So yeah.
And runners.
And runners, and runners, of course, that was a job you didn't want in the Army. Because, again, just like the commo guys that have the wire on their back, the Germans see somebody running from a position, trying to go alert somebody back at headquarters or something, and that's the one they're going to take out. Snipers or artillery strikes or trench mortars on that guy, they're going to direct all the fire on him. So, yeah.
One thing that Pershing did was bring over a lot of American females because for some odd reason, men could not operate the telephone and talk distinctly. So women were used to operate the telephone lines, which made sense, but anyway.
Might have been because they had like chewing tobacco in their mouth or
Yeah,
something.
it makes sense. Or they used profanity.
Yeah, that's
Yes, sir.
The tank that you showed, what was the armament on that tank, and to what extent were the tanks used?
Yeah, 37 millimeter was the gun on there. You know, and we forget, of course, because we relate it to modern day armor. Even during World War II, of course, the 75, the infamous German 88, and then of course nowadays, you know, you've got like the M1 Abrams with 120 millimeters, and so back then it might sound like really small, but that was pretty, you know, that's pretty effective on the battlefield. There wasn't a whole lot of tank versus tank warfare in World War I. In the first place, that was one area where the Germans were a little slow to catch up technologically, although they would certainly catch up during World War II. But they did not have a lot of armor. The Allies had most of the armor, either the French or the British. And the tanks were problematic, of course, in those days too. You know, a lot of breakdowns, mechanical problems, and horrible things, I guess, to serve in. From the accounts I've read, it would be like if you could imagine locking yourself in a steel closet with about 10 lawnmower engines all running in there, you know? That's kind of what it was like. So.
Can you relate how the Sioux and the code talkers fit into that whole mix?
Well, actually, I'm not so sure. I'm not aware of Sioux, but I know there were Choctaw.
Right.
And they used Choctaw and Cherokee code talkers during World War I. They may have used Sioux as well. And they used them in a very similar capacity as they did the Navajo code talkers in the Pacific during World War II. You know, they had their own language that they could use, and very effective, very effective. What is so interesting is that when Stuart was talking about the mix, the ethnic mix in the AEF, all kinds of different immigrant groups, Hispanics, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Native Americans. What's so interesting is they were all amalgamated. They were all accepted as part of the AEF, except for African Americans. So that's what was rather unique about the military.
I noticed on one of your slides said 56% of the draftees were farmers. I thought there was an exemption for farmers during World War I. My grandfather was exempted because he was growing food.
Could be. They were growing a lot of
Initially,
food.
But eventually they drafted. Unless you were union, you had a union card, you're good to go.
Two of my great uncles were in. They were both farmers.
Yeah, but there was certainly, and I think Stuart had mentioned this too, there was certainly a different mix, especially with a lot of those National Guard units. Some of them came out of specific areas like the Prairie Division, which was out of the Midwest, Iowa and Illinois and places like that. The Yankee Division, of course, again, New England. The 77th, of course, the Statue of Liberty Division was considered to be all New Yorkers. So there was some very interesting kind of situations there. The American Army was undergoing a huge transformation from that old kind of system they had during the Civil War, where your regiments, and then later your divisions, were formed from specific geographical areas in the United States. And of course, we don't see a lot of that exists anymore. A lot of that was changed interwar years between World War I and World War II, and with the restructuring and the National Guard and the regular Army and everything like that. So,
What was the maximum age